Indeed, I am super excited about this conversation and this ongoing collaboration between Future of Good and Dark Matter Labs on in-depth conversations that examine our fragile future. Today, I'd like to get into the future of social finance and impact investing, and it's perhaps one of those tools that still offers a lot of hope for many change makers in Canada and around the world. And as you know, Future of Good now hosts Canada's largest social finance conference, the Social Finance Forum. We took it over from Mars because we believe we need to shift capital equitably, and we need to shift capital to the massive transitions the planet is experiencing. So that's one of the big reasons why we took it over. It's also the reason now, for the very first time, we have a full-time journalist covering the innovations, developments, and opportunities in social finance and impact investing in Canada. And so the invitation for us here is to examine and explore the future of social finance, its promise, its pitfalls, its opportunities, its omissions, and all of it. So I want us to sort of like dive in here, and I've got some really interesting prompts, and hopefully we'll have a really good exchange over the next 45 minutes. Yeah, but
Great.
welcome to you.
Delighted to be here, Vinod. I'm super excited. I think let's make this intense and dense, and we'll unpack it probably in another 45-minute session. But I'm very excited about this conversation because I think it's important.
Right. Yeah. I want to start with the question about narrative, and want to get your perspective on this, because we can't talk about social finance without talking about money. And there's a very particular narrative of money that has followed us and that is emerging. And so money has a number of meanings and connotations and symbols. It has value. It's a commodity. It can build trust. It can tear down trust. It has trauma associated with it. It has power. It has influence. It saves lives. Like there's so many connotations and symbols and meanings and narratives around money. But I'm curious to hear your take as you're sitting at the edge. What is the emerging narrative of money in social change?
Yeah, it's okay. So there's loads of important factors that are driving this. I think we have over monetized our economies and societies. So what's becoming very clear is that actually, for example, many societies can no longer fund, certainly Western societies can no longer fund care in the classic transaction systems. We're seeing kind of UK, many local authorities no longer able to support. Most of their budget is entirely consumed by adult and children care budgets. We're seeing the end of our monetary system is not adequately able to price the risk of climate change. So what we're seeing is our current monetary frameworks are no longer able to capture and organize either the externalities or the edge of the system. So I think one of the big shifts that we're starting to see is this kind of the hyper monetization of society and a single currency world, i.e., a monetary currency world, reaching the limits of its means of organizing. And I think at the same time, our theories of bureaucracy and means of organizing are starting to look at multi-currency systems. And I don't mean multi-currency. What I would say is multi-currency sort of financial currencies, other forms of currency of kind of social care, gift, other forms of currency become really critical. So I think one of the big paradigm leaps we're in the middle of is this move from what I would call single capital system to multi-capital systems and multi-currency systems. So I think there's a paradigm in our theory of money and the over monetization of our economies. But that paradigm is also lifted to how we use money. So the relationship with money has been largely around a theory of transaction. It's very difficult to transact here. It's very difficult to transact economies of intrinsic value relationships as opposed to commodity value relationships. So if our economy is constructed through theories of what I would call commodity thinking, most of our economy is constructed through commodity thinking. Complex and complicated constructs and care constructs are fundamentally different economies. So there's been a paradigm of our monetary model being largely constructed on commodity moments of exchange. So the theory of exchange, I think, is reaching the end of its limit. So I think and it's important in the way that you start this conversation to look at our conversations of the monetization of our economy. I also think it's really critical to look at it from that dimension, because and this is where I make a slight leap, whilst I think, social finance, impact finance is great, I think we must also acknowledge that our existing capital markets are self-terminating us.
Mm.
So it's like saying, hey, here's a nice little apple, but we'll carry on shooting at you, right? It's because the reality is our existing capital markets are orchestrating capital, whether it's in fossil fuels or whether it's into mycotoxins, in terms of plastic toxins, that are
Right.
literally self-terminating us in terms of using our social public good, terminating future value, creating conflict frameworks that are going to actually self-terminate us. So I do think one of the big challenges that the impact finance faces, it's no longer sufficient to marginally grow the field. I think we have to radically transform our capital markets. Without it, we're self-terminating. So I think the monetization question also sits with a kind of actually where the transition lies. And then the final point I would say on that macro level is that it's also clear at current interest rates. And if you look at long-term US bond yields, 30-year bonds rising at sort of 5.8%, which is unusual, right? What we're now seeing is it's virtually becoming impossible to do the investments and allocations that are required for our transition framework. So we're losing our capacity to allocate capital at the infrastructure scale that's required to support the transition. And that is throwing up. And I believe we're going to have long-term persistent high interest rates, largely driven by shocks in the system. So if we're operating in a high interest rate economy, remember that average interest rates historically between the 17th century onwards have been circa 7%,
Mm.
right? That's been the average interest rate. If we're operating back in those averages, if not a little bit higher, and shocks are actually driving that to become higher, what we're going to see is inflation rates persistent, interest rates being persistently high. That will throttle our investment capabilities to actually be able to invest in transition. So one of the big things that we're doing, and this is the paper that we're exploring, is how do you start to think about differential interest rates or differentiated interest rates by central banks? So central banks will need to change their interest rate policy to say if you're doing a nature-based investment, it's going in at a -1. If you're buying white good consumables, it's going to be 10%. We're going to have to become much more tailored at the macroeconomic level to guide this economy. And I suppose this is my one thing. It is no longer sufficient to think about impact investment as guiding us out of this crisis.
Mm.
We have to get involved at the macroeconomic capital markets redesign level to deal with the scale of the crisis that we're facing in order to find a viable path. So that's the one thing I'd say is I think it's really important to engage at that.
Right. Yeah. There's many threads to pick up there, Indy, and I suppose I'll start with the commodity thinking that you put out there, and I'm really curious to hear your take on you know because I certainly see this as part of the promise and potential of impact finance and social finance is to um, take us, take us at least partway through a journey of decommodifying money. Do you see that as a possibility?
I see it as a possibility, but I don't know of any term sheets from impact investors that
Right.
are actually that are actually manifesting that opportunity. Or I mean, I think the idea of how we systemically decolonize capital, how do we operate in multi-currency business models? How do we understand future liabilities which are yet not priced into the system? I don't think impact investment economies have become sophisticated second horizon investors. They're not operating, and this is part of the big problem. 750 million by the kind of social finance fund is fantastic, but the reality is we're going to need billions, if not trillions. It's an 8.7 trillion gap, 8.7, 8.9 trillion gap a year of capital, right?
Right.
Just for us to keep the numbers at the right order at the global level, and the interest rates of those allocations. What are the interest rates we're applying to those allocations? How are we actually allocating capital at the speed and quantum that's required? It's infrastructure scale capital that's going to require. I would like the Canadian infrastructure bank to become the Canadian impact infrastructure bank. I want it to perceive itself through an impact lens at the infrastructure scale. That's what's required. Because when you start to actually invest in infrastructure through the impact lens, and you're looking at second and third order beneficiary effects, we will start to change the flow of capital markets, but we will also start to build the infrastructure level capability for our next generation sort of products and services. And this is about the right stack of capital being available. Like, I'll give you a benign example. You got tech startups investing in electric trucks, right? We don't actually have the grid infrastructure. Remember, a charging grid for electric trucks, each charging grid is equivalent to 30,000 homes. 30,000 homes. We don't have the grid or the grid infrastructure to actually build that electrified logistics economy. So unless you build the impact infrastructure investment and the impact infrastructure and the kind of products and services frameworks and the market transition investment frameworks, i.e. transitioning supply and demand in a coordinated fashion, unless you build that capital stack, you don't move complex products. What you end up with is minor products at the edges of infrastructure, minor products and services innovation. And I think we're not deploying and structuring capital at the scale of the transition. So if we're going to move this, we need an impact infrastructure plan. We need an impact market transition fund, which is looking at supply and demand orchestration. We need impact risk capital funds. And we also need impact sunset capital funds that are taking hydrocarbon or toxic industries and actually sunsetting them with almost like a bad bank for actually closing down industries which are high toxic. It's a new stack of capital required to operate at the scale of the transition market. It's great what the social finance fund has done, but I think we have to build whole new system level capabilities to be commensurate to the problem scale.
Right, and this is I suppose is one of the sort of the things that that we're seeing over and over again is social finance has a venture lens, and you've known this for a long time, of course, and even right now there are stories going around. CBC just did one. I think it was last week. That noted that there are 100,000 fewer entrepreneurs in Canada than 20 years ago. And so the question is what, within the social finance ecosystem, well, okay, great. If that's the case, what if we could boost entrepreneurship, make it purposeful through social finance? But I really struggle with this ventures versus systems lens, and what if the future of social finance is not actually venture financing? Because we've been there. It's happened. It hasn't actually got us the transitions that we want. So yeah.
But Vinod, this is exactly what I'm saying. I think the future of impact investment cannot be venture driven. I would like, if we've got the best risk capital on the table, let's build the next generation generative AIs through impact investment. Because if we can introduce radical new life-affirming technologies, not extraction technologies for artificial intelligence, but life-affirming technologies of AI, great. Right. Superb. Let's put some bloody real risk capital down there and construct life-affirming technologies rather than extraction technologies with machine learning. At the same time, unless we build the impact infrastructure investment funds, we're not going to shift the infrastructure grids. There could be the information infrastructure grids, there can be the data registry infrastructures, there can be the tree canopies of cities, there can be the mental health of cities. So right. Novel forms of infrastructure. Unless you build the transition frameworks, how do you invest in moving us to plant-based food diets, which we're going to have to do in order to deal with the transition and to move towards bioregional economies? We're going to have to actually transition our food system. That's going to be about supply, demand, logistics transformation in a coordinated allocation framework with coordinated outcome or sort of outcome benefits on the table. So the problem, as you rightly say, we've overinvested in basically a marginal venture economy, not recognizing this as a structural transition of a whole sequence of asset classes that are required in a profound way. So we don't finance next generation distributed grid infrastructures, energy, sort of whether it's solar meets battery power meets solar battery and heat pumps as an integrated provision, as a new grid infrastructure of energy justice and distributed energy production in a new format. That has got to be the profile of the next generation investment. And you're absolutely right. We've overinvested in venture and not understanding the infrastructure, not understanding the market transition capitals, and supporting existing industry transitioning, and not supporting actually the sunsetting of old industry. That's a capital stack.
Right. But how do you deal with this tension though? Here's like there is a a whole range of communities that have been systemically excluded from building generational wealth. And this is something that has come up, over and over again. Is systemically excluded, and we have a right to build generational wealth. And so, and of course, entrepreneurship and ventures is one big way to do that. There's a whole range of other ways, but I really struggle with this, Indy. I really struggle with this notion of, and in many ways, if you listen to the stories, you sort of go, yeah, like you know, I, I empathize with you, and I hear your struggle, and but we're in this era where, um, you know, uh, building generational wealth. Like I struggle with that notion of accumulation. So how do you reconcile with this?
Yeah,
Because we are in that
I'll
era of
absolutely look.
injustices. Yeah,
I'll go at it. I'll go at it straight away. Right.
yeah,
The existing S&P 100. I think the stats are if you price social environmental goods onto the existing S&P 100, 70% of the S&P 100 is not left standing. Right? It's dead. So when we talk about actually most of our intergenerational wealth, is actually the wealth has been constructed through externalizing vast amounts of costs at the social public level. So I think we have to delegitimize that theory of wealth first. Like
right,
my shirt, whatever, 35-pound shirt, if you were to price it properly in terms of social environmental costs, it's closer to 250 to 450 pounds. Where is that other money gone? It's gone into costs borne at soil level, at poverty that is created in certain landscapes, destruction of water systems that is created on site, CO2 production. That wealth that we're talking about is fundamentally a function of vast externalization. So that's one thing that I think we have to acknowledge. Second thing I think we have to acknowledge is I think 21st century wealth is going to be fundamentally different from 19th century and early 20th century wealth.
in
I
what way?
think so. I would argue that if you've got, I think, distributed energy held by communities is going to be a critical piece of supply. Actually, rewilded ecological systems, which are stable and generative, will be a critical source of health. I would argue access to high nutrition, highly resilient food systems will be a critical source of wealth.
Hmm.
I think the foundations of our economy are being recast. Energy, materiality, nutrient systems, all the way through to mental health, space standards. I think the theory of wealth is being recast because the foundations are being recast. And how we own the infrastructures of these new 21st century foundations, I think is where we're going to build intergenerational wealth. So I would argue that that is where we actually allocate to build a new thesis of justice and how we build that, and we make sure those aren't, all those things are susceptible to vast amounts of rent-seeking infrastructures, all those things,
Right.
because they are quasi-monopolistic goods. So how we govern and structure them for them not to be new rent-seeking infrastructures is going to be, I think, the paradigm. You and I know this, right? So if we look at the US economy, what has gone up in price? Housing, health, education, it's all the common goods that have gone up in price.
Right.
Computers haven't gone up in price. Microchips haven't gone up in price. White goods haven't gone up in price. It's actually all been on the rent-seeking infrastructures of society because we've created the incentives for that. And so I think the paradigm leap as we move from this hydrocarbon energy economy to a new economy, which is going to cascade all the way through our materiality, our food system, all the way through to our health system provisions, that I think actually how we build that, how we democratize wealth in that process, I think this is a one in a generational game to actually rebuild that into
Right.
generational wealth in a fundamentally different paradigm.
So then to me it sounds like we've been asking a lot of the wrong questions, because a lot of what a lot of the social finance that I'm seeing now, particularly social finance that um, is centering justice and equity is more concerned with how many people access or consume versus how we consume, right? So as an example, it's concerned with how many of us can own land or own a home or own whatever, versus exploring how land can be used, which is a very, very different question around justice. So what do you make of that?
Look, this is my slight critique of that. I think the impact investment landscape is still being operationalized in correcting the existing market. It's a market correction mechanism.
Right.
So it's like, it's like adjusting the edges of the market failure problem. And I don't think that gets us home. A tree is not an asset in the market economy. A tree is a liability, right? It's timber that's an asset, right? It's a whale is not an asset. A living whale is not an asset. It's a dead whale that's an asset. So our soil is not an asset. It's an infinite resource which we exhaust and destroy. Like, we have to understand that if we root ourselves in just trying to do marginal fixes to actually the justice side of those, actually we become self-terminating. I think the opportunity in the paradigm is to recognize there's a new class of entangled assets. And I would not even call them assets. Like they are kind of new theories of agencies. These are
Right.
agent-based systems. How do we democratize wealth in this new agent systems worldview? And I think that's a genuine invitation. And I think this is not just for this. I think it could be for, as we're doing work around self-owning housing. We're doing work around land which owns itself. In the Canadian context. And those are interesting because they change the paradigm of these rent-seeking systems into an alternative thesis. My big thing is that this is much more of a structural paradigm leap. How do we use that social finance fund not to fix the edges of the market failure, but to actually structurally reform the construction of wealth in society? That's the paradigm.
Right. Because when you talk about some like the market corrections, it is exactly what's happening now, because there's a lot of talk, and this isn't sort of unique to Canada, but around the world, a global affordability crisis, and this word affordability is I want to examine this a bit more with you, because to make things more affordable means to continue to consume in a way and to own in a way, right? And so the what you're centering here is affordability, and then there's this sort of this narrative around, oh well, we're in the middle of an affordability crisis, and so things used to be far more affordable 25, 30, 40 years ago. And as we look to the future, nothing's really all that affordable: houses, education, et cetera, et cetera. So like, I even wonder if affordability is the right question, because what I would want to see is like perpetual affordability, right? And so, but is that even the right question? I don't know, because now the social finance is sort of cast as this, like it's a way to make things more affordable. It's a way to make education more affordable. It's a way to make childcare more affordable. But given what you're saying, I'm not so sure if affordability is a central question.
Look, I understand the politics of affordability. When food prices have gone up 40% and people are struggling to put food on the table, certainly in the UK context, or if energy has gone up, I get the everyday politics of it, but you're absolutely asking the right question. Yes, I get the politics of affordability, but is it strategically the right question? Because I would argue that the fundamental problem we're facing is, if this shirt is worth, is costing the earth at a total cost, system cost level, somewhere between 250 to 400 pounds. Sure, I could sort of use monetary mechanisms. I could use all sorts of other forms of anti-slavery mechanisms to keep this shirt at 25 pounds. But every time I'm using them, I'm actually externalizing costs. Those externalities are no longer ignorable. And they're no longer ignorable, or they're pricing themselves in climate change, which is becoming a catastrophic effect, or they're pricing themselves in social tipping points, which will also have catastrophic effects. So actually, what looks like affordability of optimization is no longer working, because I think what we need is a different material economy of how do we construct a material economy of a share in a way that doesn't externalize vast amounts of costs which self-terminate us. So I think our short-term affordability is self-terminating us. And that requires a much deeper reconsideration of not just looking, I'll use it, I'll use an example of a can of Coke and an orange or an apple, right? A can of Coke or a can of cola externalizes vast amounts of costs, right? Aluminium, CO2, mining, water, sugar production, diabetes, go down the road, right? It's highly addictive, which is great. It's got sugar in it, so it's highly addictive. It's great. The renewable apple, or the sustainable apple, the regenerative apple, which maybe if it's well harvested, is sustaining the soil, it's nutritious, it's health orientated, it's supported huge amounts of bioecological services. The two might be comparable in price at a unit level in the supermarket. 99 cents, 99 cents. However, one is a function of being addictive and externalizing. The other one is deeply regenerative. Our capital falls on the addictive system. Our capital allocation is falling on those addictive systems, largely because actually it's deeply efficient, it's predictable, it's controllable, right? And it's got an addictive economy to it. The apple is under-advertised, under-supported, because it doesn't have an addictive economy to it, yet it's deeply nutritious. It's largely a function. Our illusions of affordability are constructed through vast amounts of externalization. And I think we're facing a paradigm. I'm not even sure if you did a true price of a house,
right?
True price, whether it could be afforded in the act of buying houses. Could we be stewards of that house and have a responsibility for the house to be a longitudinal asset? And maybe. I think we're going to need fundamentally different economic relationships with institutions and products that we buy. This shirt will be a 10-year product or a 15-year product, not a 1-year product. And that's not unusual for people like you and me. That's not like non-known to us. We've lived through it in our parents' lives and other things. So the reality is we're not cognizant about the synthesis or the construction of affordability that we made in this illusion. And that is short-circuiting us.
Right, but it is so much like just take the house as an example. For so many families and so many people, the house is what you use to finance your retirement. It's what you use to take care of yourself and your family when you're older. It's what you use to finance your children's education. So like to get to a place where, and this is where I think the struggle is today, and I agree it's a short-term thing, but we're financing our future in these self-terminating ways, as you say, but for many, that is how they finance their future. It's how they finance their children's education. It's how they finance their children's marriage and weddings. It's how they finance their retirement. So like, what are you take you sort of you take out you take out the value of the house as it exists today, because there's a whole range of things that give it the equity and the year-over-year equity growth. You take all that out, then the way we characterize and conceptualize how we finance our own future and our children's future would have to be vastly different.
Okay, but let's take the house, right?
Right.
Because I think we have to understand what is being created. If I was to take a house in Toronto, pick it up, exact house, and move it to the middle of Siberia, how much is the house worth? Nothing.
Right.
Next to nothing. So where is the value of that house coming from? It's largely coming from access to public goods. The public goods are labor markets, rule systems, transportation systems, schools, infrastructure. Those social systems, or those public goods, their value has been captured of the house. And what we've seen is houses inflating in value because those public goods have become more valuable in society. And if you look at it through that lens, what it throws up is a really interesting problem that we've privatized those common goods in the hands of house owners. This has been the great second enclosure. Like, think of it that way. This has been the great second enclosure of synthetic public goods into the hands of private capital. Because, you and I can have a house, we've done nothing to it for 20 years, that value is still appreciated because it's been a function of those common goods. Now, I'm not saying, and I totally agree with you, we then engineered a social security system, a social finance system. People have earned more from their houses than they've earned from their jobs. We've then allocated capital to preserving this housing economy, which has meant that what we've done is allocated most of society's capital to unproductive assets. That means we've misgeared our economy from the productive economy side to actually non-productive assets, which are housing. And we've actually used that as part of our generative economy. So I think the long arc of history will talk about this as one of the greatest economic mismanagements of society that's ever happened. And we'll talk about it as a second great enclosure, which gave wealth to a whole generation of people, but also created a whole false economy around that, which actually destroyed the productive capabilities of society as systemic. So this is why, unfortunately, I do think it's important to tell the macro story, because I think we have to recognize we are the beneficiaries of goods we've had nothing to do with creating, right? And I think there's a humility that we have to have in that conversation. And then we have to be part of actually transitioning that macro story, the stories we tell ourselves, and to then have to talk about a new form of social compact, or what does that start to mean? And there are pathways into this. Governments could imagine new forms of kind of value sharing structures to be able to redistribute and build wealth, commonwealth pools in different ways. I think there are different ways of dealing with this, so I think we just haven't explored them. And I think in the act of a crisis, we will explore them. And the act of when a crisis occurs, we will see the shattering of open windows of what is the perceived rights of us versus the perceived needs of all. That will open up things. I mean, just to put this in context, when World War II was happening, governments confiscated iron railings outside people's homes, right? Confiscated gold. Like, paradigm shattering moments change the norms of what is acceptable. I just want us to recognize we are the false beneficiaries of this value. And yes, it's been a critical part of how government has also accelerated that. I don't think we change that right here, but I think that's going to be one of the big conversations on the table as we start to re-gear our economies at the macro.
Right. Yeah. And it's not just, it's not just houses, I suppose. There are a number of the core assumption now is that the future is unaffordable, and so we have to save for it in some way. And there's, in addition to leveraging and using houses, there's a whole range of at least in Canada, there's a whole range of savings products out there. You have there's a fundamental assumption that higher education, will be hugely unaffordable, and so there is a registered education savings plan that that families can put money in, and likewise, we opened the conversation talking about care and care systems. Similar thing. If you have someone who requires deep care, there there is an assumption that life for them is going to be unaffordable, and so you can access the registered disability savings plan to save for their future. So so it's really interesting what's happening here, because we're using these capital markets savings products to finance and make our futures more affordable. At the same time,
creating the illusion for it, Vinod. I mean, remember, it's also worth recognizing in parts of Nova Scotia, you can't get insurance on your house anymore. Because the idea of construction, so as volatility in the system, we should call it climate breakdown. As climate breakdown happens, you are losing predictability, and as you're losing predictability, you're losing insurability. And as soon as you lose insurability, you can no longer get a mortgage, right? So those products that we're creating, I still wonder whether they're parts of an illusion of a kind of a predictable linear future out there. And actually, if you look at what we're starting to see in volatility in the system,
Right. Possibly. And, you mentioned insurance, and this is one of the conversations happening in Canada now because, and even insurance as an aid strategy, you know, against wildfires and floods and all of those things that folks in Nova Scotia experienced. And you probably saw this. The UK just announced this. They're sort of buying disaster insurance as part of their aid strategy. So insurance against expensive disasters in communities across the country or in countries to avoid these sudden spikes in emergency spending. So and there's a whole bunch of talks of setting up risk pools, and I'm curious, like, the insurance industry is going to go through a fundamental transformation, it feels like, but now there's a really I feel like it's a worrying conversation around buying disaster insurance. So what do you make of this development?
So I think the thing I put forward is, I think we can talk about financialization of that risk. It goes back to the monetary problem.
Hmm.
And I think what we're starting to see, I think in parts of Australia, the annual insurance of a house is $500,000. The annual, because it's
Hmm.
basically expected to burn down and having to be rebuilt, right? So like what I suppose I'm saying is the challenge is not necessarily the financial risk. It's actually, like you were saying, how do you pool liabilities together in a place? How do you pool those liabilities to allow for natural hedging and natural investments against those liabilities? So I
Right.
think it's no longer about the synthetic hedging of those risks, but actually the orchestration of those risks into real world hedging and real world management of those risks. And that I think is going to be a key thing. And what insurance companies do have is the capabilities to be able to actually orchestrate the supply chains and the logistics chains for the management of those risks in new formats. And I think you're right. There's a new paradigm of insurance coming. And the paradigm of insurance is going to look a lot more about prevention and management of risk as an integrated function rather than actually as the management of risk at the portfolio abstract global level capital allocation function. So I think there's a much more active strategy that's coming as opposed to a passive allocation strategy.
Right. Yeah. Because I think when I was running Rito Hall Foundation a number of years ago, this is one of the things that we spoke about a little bit. This is very early days where we talked about pooling liabilities, pooling capital, pooling risks, because we took a experimented with a multi-capital model of support, right? Where we tried to build a multi-capital model and costed it, financial capital, intellectual capital, human capital, social capital, natural capital, etc. And then it almost felt like it was so early, and it still feels like it's early. You sit there in board meetings and folks are confused about it. Like, how are you going to cost this stuff in?
Yeah, but
What?
that's because that's because we're pricing it at the wrong object level. I
Hmm.
think when you price that at the infrastructure level, say the tree canopy of a city, you recognize the benefits of communities looking after those urban forests means that the likelihood of those urban forests surviving is 90% versus if it's just planted by third-party planters. So when you look at sufficient scale at the infrastructure level, those hybrid capital models become not only possible, they become computationally drivable, and they become at the macro level essential. Because actually, if you don't do that, you can't deal with the liabilities. You just cannot monetize the liabilities
Hmm.
um, and pay for the maintenance in any other way. So I think those hybrid capital models are at the right scale and the right scale and scope, at the intersection of kind of aggregation, but also relational scope. I also think we needed some of the kind of computational capabilities that have only really come to the fore in the last 2, 3 years and just about maturing to be able to do this. So I think it's both these things together that are actually opening up those high multi-capital systems to be able to make, so I think we can now construct multi-agent, structured economic systems is what we call them, which are multi-agent transaction economies. So how do 600 urban forests, which are operationalized by communities in relationships of care, work to build, match the ecological services that they provide to the liability owners. You can do that real-time matching. You don't have to do that as commodity transactions. You can do it as probabilistic transactions. So you don't try to create false theories of exchange, but services like quasi-insurance models. That is computationally now possible, both at the care level. So we're doing a piece of work of how people relate to a river and changing theories of governance to being about how you identify and relate and care for a river. So you can build the computational frameworks and relationship models at the unit level of the urban forest, but you can also structure the structured economic system at the whole city level. That is a paradigm because we've now built both the participatory frameworks and the participatory governance frameworks, as well as the computational frameworks, to build the economies you've been talking about and built at people like places like the Hall. Sorry, I can't remember the first name.
Rita Hall, yeah.
Rita Hall Foundation, right? When you were doing that work. So I think these things are coming together. I think there's a moment when these things are now more possible than they've ever been.
Right. Indy, just conscious of time here. We've got a few minutes left, and I want to sort of give you an opportunity to close with this. Perhaps given the paradigm shifts that that we're in the middle of, the transitions the world is in the middle of, the type of imagination that is required at this moment. What then is, in your view, the promise of social finance?
I think, it's one of those moments. It's not 2004. We're not in Kansas anymore, to use Dorothy Lang. I think we're not in 2004. And I think the biggest thing that social finance opens up, I think I really deeply request that social finance start to think not at the edges of market reform, but building the next generation transition markets that are required. I think it needs to walk out of its own mental straitjacket, which is to look at edge market reform frameworks, actually talking about the transition to new markets and new theories of capital markets and transition capital markets that are required and that are going to be required to move billions and trillions, as opposed to imagining how do we efficiently move 750 million. This is seed capital for a new generation conversation. That liquidity is priceless. I mean, that's the biggest thing I would say. That liquidity offered by the Canadian government to actually think and operationalize and think about the space, that is a priceless opportunity. And that is the obligation. And I think I cannot state enough. We are not in Kansas. We're not in 2004. This is not going to be about building some kind of sustainable chocolate companies or sort of building some sort of sustainable water packaging company. It doesn't get us home. We self-terminate. Those are palliative care strategies at best. So I think the obligation with this liquidity is to start to think much more structurally. And I think why this conversation was important to me, why I particularly wanted to have this with Vinod, is that this is going to require monetary level thinking. It's going to require macroeconomic thinking. It's going to also require new infrastructure investments. It's going to require new market transition infrastructures in terms of shifting critical sectors. It's going to require sunset capital finance, and it's also going to require new forms of entry. This is a stack problem. And I think we have to use the stack to be able to do that. That's my biggest plea here, that this, we are not going to be able to move enough money without actually doing something pretty crazy and impressive at the monetary level, because because of interest rates and inflation rates. So we are going to require monetary innovation. We're not going to be able to do this unless we shift our infrastructure investment thinking to be able to focus on impact infrastructures and look at new classes of infrastructure, tree canopies, material economies, all these things. So we're not going to be able to move this transition unless we do the land reforms and the land transitions that are required. We're not going to be able to do these reforms unless we build new forms of circular material financing. This is a different order of problem. And I think what social finance brings is how do we finance societal transitions? So I would finance societal transition. That's the biggest game on the table. That is where we have to go. And that's why I think this is a really critical conversation. So that's my one plea to everyone in the space, because you literally come with the kindest of hearts and the best of endeavors. And that, with what's required, I think that's the opportunity.
Right. Indy, absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for sharing your perspectives and your passion and energy your enthusiasm for the possibilities here. And I think that there's thousands of folks who are going to be watching and listening to this conversation, and I sincerely hope that there is some new possibilities that emerge out of this. So thank you so much again for making time for this. Absolute pleasure, and super inspiring work that you folks are doing at Dark Matter. I look forward to hosting another conversation on Fragile Future very soon.
Really look forward to it, Vinod. Thank you for everything you're doing, and thank you for making space for this conversation. Genuinely.
Super.